It's the winter of 1950. North Korea, a tiny village in Hamgyong province. A 19-year-old girl named Lee Soo-nok was jolted awake by this thunderous explosion. It shakes the ground right under her. She rushes outside and she just freezes. Because one side of her village is on fire, totally swallowed by a sea of flames. The villagers told her later on that it was actually US and South Korean soldiers doing the burning. They were setting their own supplies alight because the Chinese army was pushing them back hard. They had no choice. If they left the supplies behind, the Chinese would use them. This desperate withdrawal was part of what became one of the most legendary battles in Marine Corps history, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. It happened in the bitter winter of late November to early December 1950. But before we dive into the largest and most astonishing evacuation in history that followed, let's rewind about 5 months earlier, back to that summer. In the early morning of June 25, 1950, the Korean War began with a full-scale invasion from the north. North Korean forces quickly captured Seoul and pushed the South Korean troops all the way down to the Busan area. But then, everything flipped. The UN forces pulled off the daring Incheon landing operation and turned the tide of the war. They recaptured Seoul and pushed north, advancing all the way to the Yalu River, the border with China, in just 2 months. But that's when things changed again. China entered the war, sending wave after wave of soldiers to support North Korea. Within days, the balance flipped. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, UN forces were forced to fall back. That brings us back to the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. Freezing winds, relentless exhaustion, and no hope of victory in sight. Surrounded by Chinese forces, the Marines fought not just the enemy, but a cold that claimed more men than bullets. The commanders knew it. They couldn't keep fighting. The only choice left was to retreat. But even that wasn't simple. To the south, the port city of Wonsan had already fallen to the North Korean forces. That meant there was no way out by land. Only one path remained, the sea. And among all the ports still accessible to the UN forces, Hungnam, the northeastern port city, was the only one capable of handling a massive evacuation. Word began to spread through the villages of North Korea that the UN and South Korean troops were retreating. As the Chinese closed in, panic followed. Families gathered in, trying to decide what to do. Some chose to stay, others to run. But leaving was anything but simple. How could entire families abandon everything they had? In many homes, the elderly parents stayed behind, watching in tears as their sons and daughters fled with the children. Lee Soo-nok was one of them. She couldn't take everyone. With her 2-year-old son strapped to her back, she left home with her husband. Her parents and younger siblings were left behind, slowly disappearing from sight as she kept moving forward. Like her, many refugees believed they'd be able to return home in just 3 months. So when they said goodbye, many families promised each other, "We'll be back soon." But that goodbye turned out to be their last. Lee Soo-nok said the same words as she left, believing she'd return home soon. But as she looked back and saw her hometown fading in the distance, a heavy feeling came over her. Deep down, she knew she might never come back. Meanwhile, the road to Hungnam was packed with refugees, nearly 100,000 following the retreating troops. In the chaos, families tried to stay together, but many still lost loved ones along the way. It was another moment when countless families were separated, never to see each other again. At the same time, the US military was stunned to see so many civilians on the move. They hadn't fully understood what life in Korea had really been like, so when they planned their withdrawal, they never imagined tens of thousands of refugees would join their escape. But why were so many ordinary people desperate to head for the sea? Most of them were locals who had welcomed the UN forces during the northward advance. They saw them as liberators, worked with them, and hoped for the better future. But when the tide of war shifted again, their hopes quickly turned into fear. They knew that if the North Korean army came back, retaliation was unavoidable. For them, there was only one choice left: run or die. But that's not the only reason. Another fear spread like wildfire through the refugee crowds. The Americans are going to drop an atomic bomb in the north. Only a few years earlier, many had at least heard of the devastation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. Whatever the reason, all the refugees wanted just one thing: survival. Abandoning their belongings, their houses, and their hometowns, they formed an endless stream of people heading toward the port of Hungnam. At Hungnam port, nearly 100,000 refugees began to gather. But could the US military really take on all those desperate people begging to be saved? At first, the answer was no. It wasn't that simple. At the time, Dr. Hyun Bong-hak, who was serving as an interpreter for the US Army, went to see Colonel Forney. He felt deep compassion for the refugees, knowing they would almost certainly be killed if they were left behind, so he pleaded with him to let them board the ships. These were the people who had welcomed and helped the Americans. If the North Korean troops returned, they would all be executed. They had to be saved. Colonel Forney agreed, so he went to General Almond, commander of the US 10th Corps, who was in charge of the evacuation. But Almond's first response was doubtful. The Chinese army was closing in fast. Taking time to load civilians might cost soldiers' lives, and there was always the risk that enemy spies could be hiding among the refugees. Above all, there simply weren't enough ships. In fact, as the evacuation from Hungnam became inevitable, the UN had already issued an order. Every available vessel in Korea and Japan was to head for Hungnam. Countless ships were on their way, but no one knew how many would actually arrive in time. The task was overwhelming. 100,000 US troops had to be evacuated, along with 350,000 tons of military supplies. Even with the incoming ships, no one was sure if they could carry both the soldiers and all the equipment out safely. Watching the American troops and their supplies board the ships one by one, the refugees left behind grew more desperate with each passing day. Would we ever get on those ships? Would we survive this? The uncertainty was crushing. But then, as the US forces completed most of their evacuation, more and more ships that had been requested began arriving in Hungnam. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Through Dr. Hyun Bong-hak's relentless efforts, General Almond, who had been hesitant about the idea, finally gave in. After the soldiers and equipment are loaded, the remaining space will be used for refugees. In that moment, the Hungnam evacuation was no longer just a military operation. It became a story of humanity, of choice, and of compassion in the face of war. Still, the reality was harsh. Compared to the enormous number of refugees, the ships were far from enough. Most of the vessels were cargo freighters meant for transporting supplies, not people. That meant space for civilians was extremely limited. To make room, some military cargo was even sacrificed. And so, on the freezing dock in Hungnam, refugees began climbing aboard, one by one, clutching whatever hope they had left. Among the ships that arrived was one that would go down in history as the Ship of Miracles, the SS Meredith Victory. The Meredith Victory was a 7,600-ton Victory-class cargo ship, only about 5 years old at the time. It was one of the very last merchant vessels left for the evacuation. When the crisis broke out, the ship had been in Busan unloading a cargo of aviation fuel, but as the situation in Hungnam grew desperate, and every available vessel was being called in, the Meredith Victory was suddenly ordered north. On December 21st, 1950, it sailed into Hungnam harbor and was about to make history. The captain of the ship was Leonardo Laru. When he arrived at Hungnam and looked around, he was stunned. The scene was overwhelming. Thousands of North Korean refugees were crammed onto the docks. Behind them, the Chinese army was closing in, ready to strike. In front of them, nothing but the wide, freezing sea. If they weren't taken aboard, they would all surely die. For Captain Laru, there was no real choice. Without a moment's hesitation, he made his decision to rescue as many people as his ship could possibly carry. Then, on the night of December 22nd at 9:30 p.m., the boarding began. The SS Meredith Victory was a large vessel, but it was built as a cargo ship, not a passenger ship. In fact, it was designed to carry only about 60 people. There were no stairways or facilities inside for passengers at all. So the crew improvised. They suspended a wooden plank from the cargo crane, allowing people to stand on it, and then carefully lower the refugees down into the vast, empty cargo spaces. To squeeze in even more people, they laid steel plates across the massive vertical holds, dividing them into layers, stacking human lives one on top of another. Once the hatches closed, there was no more light, only darkness, suffocating air, and the press of bodies packed together. By the time the decks were finally filled, the impossible had happened. 14,000 refugees had boarded the ship, crammed into a vessel meant for just 60. And so, on December 23, 1950, the SS Meredith Victory pulled away from the port of Hungnam, carrying the largest rescue operation by a single ship in history. Lee Soo-nok was there too, with her son and husband, part of an escape unlike anything the world had ever seen. She saw Hungnam Harbor erupt in flames. The explosions were intentional. US forces were destroying the remaining supplies and facilities, so nothing could be used by the Chinese army. All the while, this voyage was steeped in danger. The ship was still carrying huge amounts of aviation fuel. One careless spark or a torpedo along the way, even an enemy attack, and all 14,000 souls on board could have been wiped out in an instant. Yet against all odds, the ship of miracles made it through. Over 14,000 lives saved. No casualties, not one. And when the ship finally arrived, after passing Busan and heading to Geoje, there were 5 more people on board. 5 babies, born overnight, right there on the ship. It was December 24th, 1950, Christmas Eve. That's why this rescue is remembered as the miracle of Christmas, and why the SS Meredith Victory is recorded as Guinness World Records for rescuing more people than any single ship in history. Now, we cannot truly finish this story without mentioning Lee Soo-nok. What looked like a happy ending was actually just the beginning of a much harder chapter. After arriving in an unfamiliar land, the refugees faced a brutal reality. They lived in makeshift shacks carved out of wooden ration boxes, doing anything just to survive. In that very chaos, Lee Soo-nok lost the son she had carried all the way from Hungnam. She never found him again. But for her, and for thousands like her, the struggle to survive continued. If anything, this reminds us that happy endings exist mostly in movies. On screen, the miracle is the finish line, but in real life, it's often just the starting point of another struggle. We remember these miracles not because they fixed everything, but because they prove that even in the darkest chapter of history, light can still break through. Knowing that such a miracle once happened, and that people endure the long, harsh road that followed, gives us the strength to face our own journey today.